Sarah, thanks very much for joining me on the Creative Souls of Clare podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Rory. It's lovely to chat to you.
And you're in your studio at the moment by the looks of things?
That's right. I'm in my studio here in Ennisdiamond, County Clare. It's a combination studio and gallery. At the moment, it's probably more studio because I'm spending a lot more time kind of focusing on my own painting.
Are you deep in it at the moment, or where would you say you're at in the spectrum of creative flow, or are you immersed or tinkering? Or
I'm at a really interesting stage. I think a lot of people that work creatively might recognize this kind of cyclical flow that you can get into as an artist, that you'll start a project and it might be stop and start and stop and start before you find your feet within a series of work. And then you flow really strong with it and it grows and it gets stronger and stronger. And then it'll start to develop its own way of ending that project. So I'm actually at sort of at the same time, I'm kind of at the ending of one project and the beginning of another. So there's a lot of stopping and starting. But I've just, I'm changing medium at the moment. So I'm working in oils for the first time in several years, after many years of working primarily in acrylics. And I'm just finding it to be the most rewarding medium. It's just every day I I can't wait to start painting, and I'm kind of impatient with any distractions.
oh, that's fantastic! And so, what brought that about? Was it did you feel one episode was ending and another being born, or?
Well, I'll tell you, as an artist, I'm leery of that that stagnation that can happen when you overwork an idea or an image or a kind of a series of thoughts. So if you overwork it, it gets staid and stale and starts to stagnate. And so what I do for myself is I find my own challenges. I find ways of saying, okay, right, we're comfortable with this, let's change it. Like, so I'd have my standard color palette, which I love and I'm very comfortable with, and I'll work with it like without even thinking. And then I'll say, okay, right, I'm going to change my red and see what that does to my palette. Or I'll work with a much more thick impasto kind of paint, which is applying it more thickly instead of thinly, and see what does that do then to what I'm working on and how does it change it. A couple of years ago, I changed the ground that I'm working on. So the ground is the support for the paint. So either canvas or timber panel or something like that. So I changed that and started working with a different kind of ground. And it absolutely transformed the work I was doing, made it very exciting and unpredictable, right? So
These all
throwing myself
like
challenges.
These all sound like metaphors for life to me, anyway. You know, just mixing up the colors, changing the ground you stand on, and like, you know, that life can get staid and sterile and
maybe you kind of get used to the joys that you have. You take them for granted. So for me, like I'd be quite comfortable in a way of expressing myself, and then I take it for granted, and I start to lose the spontaneity that I think is really important within my own work. So then I'll look for a way to change it up. So what happened was I've been working in landscape for the last 20 years, almost exclusively working on landscapes. Now, landscapes of different sorts, whether, you know, there are figures in the landscape, whether there are, you know, it's an architectural landscape or a pastoral scene or this kind of thing, or whether you're closing in on something very close up or you're looking very distant, all kinds of different landscapes. But I got there because I came here, and I was submerged into the Clare landscape, which is profound.
Okay, so is this 20 years? Let's just get a bit of a context for you, because what happened 20 years ago? Where did landscapes come in? Is this when you moved to Clare? I've no idea, you know.
Okay, so back up. So historical backup. So 20 years ago, my husband and I moved to Clare. We moved to Ireland from San Francisco, California, in the United States, and that was about as big of a change and adjustment as I'd ever experienced. Now, it was, I won't say it was all smooth sailing at the beginning. It was quite difficult. We arrived in November, and I had no experience with the short days and hard weather of an Irish winter, but I got used to it soon enough. So we arrived and began to find our feet, and soon enough, the landscape really became such a large part of my experience of the place that I found myself as an artist wanting to address it. So that's kind of how I landed into landscape painting. I had been a painter, but more of a figurative painter, and had spent years painting large-scale murals in California.
Was that
and then I
was that in San
sorry
Francisco?
in San Francisco, yeah.
And
Yeah,
is that anything connected to the mural scene in the Mission District?
absolutely, yeah. So
Oh,
I was
wow.
living in the Mission District, and I was working for an organization called Precita Eyes Mural Arts Center.
Oh, yeah.
They're just a wonderful community organization. I worked there for how many years? I worked there for 3 years in-house, and did a lot. Like every nonprofit organization, I found myself doing just about everything. You know,
Yeah.
it's
I'm quite familiar with well, not overly familiar, but I've spent some time in that Mission District myself and Susan, and I mean, it's so rich in particularly like the Latin and Mexican, South American, Central American influence, but also very political, would you say?
absolutely, yeah, and community oriented. That was kind of one of the governing missions of this organization that I worked for. That it wasn't that we weren't creating art for an elite few. We weren't creating art just for an exclusively artistic community, but we were actually creating art with and for the public, every part of the public. So I was painting murals with school children. I was painting murals in a community center with a broad-based group. I was painting murals in San Quentin prison with the prisoners there, and working with all kinds of different groups.
Wow, can you tell me a little bit about the prison work?
Yeah, I loved that. It was funny. Now here's a lesson about expectation. So I was I'd been working with Precita Eyes for a number of years, and then I started doing my own independent projects. And I was invited to teach art in the prison as part of a third level educational project. So the prisoners were working towards their college qualifications, and they relied entirely on volunteer teachers capable of teaching at the third level to come into the prison and teach the inmates part of an established curriculum. So they had their sociologists, and they had their history teachers, and they had all these other professors, but they didn't have anyone doing art. So a friend of mine said, listen, would you consider teaching in the prison? And I was, of course, you might imagine I was a bit intimidated, but I just thought I would do it. And so I taught there for 2 years as a volunteer, and I found it to be one of the most rewarding teaching experiences that I'd had, because you had a group that had more motivation than I think any classroom ever had. They would not mess around, because they knew that this was a great privilege, and if they messed around, that they'd be out and they'd never be allowed back. So they were very protective of me, their teacher.
Are they male, female?
Entirely male, yeah, entirely male. And it was at that point, it was a medium security prison, not a maximum security prison.
Okay. And did you have any sense of fear going in there yourself?
Of course, yeah, sure, of course. But not, that was more about my own expectation. Um, and because it's an intimidating environment to arrive into. So
Yeah.
um, American prison systems are very controlled, very, very deeply controlled. So even, I always felt more uncomfortable entering the prison, being, you know, searched and scanned, and I'd have a ultraviolet prints made on my hand to identify me as a visitor, and I, you know, all these kinds of things. Getting art materials into the prison was a nightmare, but it was transformative. I had students who had never been taught a formal art lesson that came up with some of the most moving and deeply considered works of art that I've ever seen. So it was great. It was the kind of thing that I had to embrace my fear, and I had to embrace my entering into an arena that I was completely unfamiliar with. But in doing it, you know, have now a memory that's it's very precious, you know.
Are there any particular characters? Obviously, you can't get into individual names or stories, but there any particular moments or people that have stuck with you?
Do you know, it's funny, as an art teacher, I find I'm always remembering the artwork. The faces kind of almost might blur together, but I remember the artwork that people make. So there was one student, and he was working in watercolors, and he had taught himself watercolors entirely. And he did a painting, most beautifully observed painting of a bird. I can't remember the exact songbird. It was a small songbird perched in a chain link fence on the cut stump of a tree that had grown through the chain link fence and had been pruned brutally. And this was his metaphor for where he was at. So it was an observation about the freedom of the spirit, and the his own incarceration, and it was also a direct observation of nature as well. But his own life and struggle brought into that. I found it so completely moving. It was absolutely beautiful.
Hmm. Do you remember the first time that art touched your life, or was it so early on that it's, you know, a distant memory? Do you remember childhood or any particular instances, or were there teachers or parents that created that space for you?
My my parents have been profound support throughout my whole life. I don't think there's any way of saying how important that is as an artist. I think if you have unconditional support and encouragement from parents, that the child can do anything. So I was drawing from the time I could hold a pencil, and there was always time to draw. We had loads of time. We had unfathomable reaches of time, you know, and there was always paper, and there was always pencils or crayons. My mother says, she tells the story that I was always drawing until I could read, and then I was always reading. And it was only maybe when I got back to when I got into primary school and there was art offered again, that I then returned from reading to drawing again. But I had one teacher. I would have been about 9 or 10 years old, and she was the art teacher in the primary school. And she rescued me from having to go out to the PE, physical education, and she offered me to come in instead and to be in what she called the special art class. Now, this was students who she felt just needed extra time with working on art projects. And to me, that was like being welcomed into the best club in the world. So she was already doing very interesting art projects with doing printmaking and collage and all kinds of different things. But she gave me extra time to work on projects. So I found that Miss Lewis's class, that was what it was. It was the best class. And it gave me a sense that I had a talent in art. Even though I'd been doing art for my whole life, it gave me a feeling of being special at it. Mm. And I do think that that's really important with children, to give them a feeling of what they're doing really well. That art that's inside of you is very fragile and very easy to break. I see it in kids all the time, that it could be just one careless comment that someone says, "Oh, you're not very good at that, are you?" Or someone else is better than you, or someone else is the artist in your class or in your family, and then that inner artist is broken and destroyed.
Oh,
and
for sure, yeah. And then the same with singers, or somebody say they can't sing when they're a kid.
Absolutely. So what's more important than being critical at early stages in an artist's life is to be just unconditionally supportive, to praise and to reward creative effort, especially, something that's really coming from within a child. And I was lucky enough to find that at different points in my life. There was always challenges with it. There were always the difficulties of being an art geek, or, to not having other skills. But I think having those supportive parents and having supportive teachers who recognize that is really it's a treasure.
What was the wider context of your life, Sarah? Like, where were you brought up in the city or in the sticks, or what was the general setting of your life?
That's a big one altogether as well. So I grew up in the state of Georgia, in the very deep south part of the state, in a rural county called Sumter County. And when I was very young, I was about 3 years old, 3 or 4, when my parents moved to a commune community in South Georgia called Koinonia. And it was an incredibly unique upbringing for me there. It was a place where it was a religious community. It still is a religious community. It's still there, but not dogmatic or cultish. It was a place where people had decided to live in a way that followed the lives of Jesus and his apostles quite closely, with the idea of not acquiring material possessions, and not seeking your own glory, but to do good works and to serve the community. So those were kind of the basic ideas of the commune where I grew up. And so I was surrounded by people who were theologians. I was surrounded by people who were quite committed activists for the social good, and that kind of activity was a deep part of my growing up. My father he's a doctorate of nuclear physics, and he on getting his PhD and working in the field found that the majority of the jobs available to him were directly or indirectly aimed at developing nuclear weapons, to which he was profoundly opposed. So he left that world with my mother and our family, and they moved to this commune. And that's where we lived for the majority of my growing up until the later years of high school. And then we left as a family, and I went off to university.
And where did you end up going to university?
I went as far away from Georgia as I could because I was kind of sick of it by then. And I landed in I landed. I actively sought a place at university called Brown University, which is an Ivy League school in Providence, Rhode Island. And I went there because they had a joint relationship with the Rhode Island School of Design, which is one of the best art schools in the country as well. So I attended classes. I graduated from Brown University, but I also attended classes at Rhode Island School of Design. So it was in some ways the best of both worlds. It was a very, very strong liberal arts education, but I had also this amazing access to the art classes at the art school, which were amazing. They were some of the best art classes I've ever had.
And did you find it to be significant? I mean, obviously it was a culture shift, but how did you navigate that from moving from the commune into university life and the younger woman sort of finding her place? Was that challenging, or did things flow relatively well?
No, it was hard. It was hard. I was a small fish in a very big pond, and I had, when I had been growing up in Georgia, I was I achieved very easily academically within that sphere, but I was in a much larger sphere than at university. I found my own place. I buckled down and focused on the work, just to get through and to get into it. But I like in all parts of my life, focusing on the artwork was really my joy and the reason I was there. I feel like I have pursued art with a great ambition throughout my whole life, that it's something that is at the core of me. And when times are difficult and when it's been hard to make a living or to do something that is bringing in, the rent money, I still try to stay close to art in one way or another. And that has served me really well through the years.
Have you ever come close to, you sort of allude to those moments where things were tight in terms of the rent and the bills and so on? Have you ever sort of had those darker moments where you've thought, well, I need to really jack it and
Yeah.
join the other train?
1,000 times in my life. It's not, I have always been driven by this idea of making a living from art. And I think that it's important to consider that it is your living, that it is your profession. But it's not easy. It's not easy. So I got out of university with a degree in art, and my degree advisor, I said to her, so, where do I go from here? What's my path to make a living as an artist? And she said to me, this was my advisor at university, she said, oh, you're not going to make a living at it. And left me with that, So I considered it a personal challenge then to give the lie to that I could actually make a living as an artist. And I have, as I came out of university and I worked as a picture framer, and I learned about archival picture framing and became an expert at that. I worked in a number of different art galleries, through sculpture gallery and other painting galleries, and I sold artwork to all manner of people, including corporations. I then moved out to California and worked, as I mentioned, at the Mural Center in a nonprofit environment, and I was a publicist. I was a graphic designer and a desktop publisher for that organization, and just about everything else. And along the way, I discovered that I liked teaching. And so through the work with the nonprofit, then I became an art teacher, but not necessarily like institutionally qualified as an art teacher, but I began teaching and found that I had a great passion and love for it. So I worked as something that was available as a job in San Francisco was to work as a specialist artist coming into the schools and doing programs with schools. So I worked for several years doing that, and I would fill the boot of my estate car up with boxes of paints and ladders and all kinds of things, and I'd arrive in at a school and I would teach five classes in quick succession, an art lesson.
Wow.
And then the next day I might be on to another school teaching 5 different lessons for 5 different ages. And I worked that way for a few years, but it was incredibly difficult, incredibly draining work, while also being, of course, incredibly satisfying and fulfilling.
Is one of the challenges in those scenarios where you take on jobs that are somewhat in the discipline or somewhat close to where you want to be, but they're not where you want to be, and ultimately when it comes time to evening time or weekends, you're so spent that there's no energy left for the actual thing it is you want to be doing?
That's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. I think it is a real challenge with teaching. Teaching is it's a huge expenditure of energy, both intellectual energy and physical energy. When I'm teaching, it's like I'm active. I'm moving around. I'm thinking and talking and doing examples and the whole thing. And it takes a lot out of you. I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking about my lessons, thinking about, okay, so you'd strategize, how is this lesson going to proceed? What materials am I going to need? How am I going to make sure I've got all the things I need, and that if a problem arises, I'll be able to sort it out. It's like performance a lot of the time, to make sure everything is on stage when you need it, you know. But I loved it, but it did drain me, and I wasn't really terribly effective in my own artwork while I was teaching, I have to say.
But you obviously kept your eye on the prize, you know. You like, it strikes me that there's a huge current of determination and resilience that you've displayed throughout your life.
Yeah, I hope so. I think it's yeah, that's possibly the defining characteristic. It's just being able to adapt to circumstances and to keep flowing, and to keep also, I think, an eye on my internal compass to see that I'm not drawn off course too far. I had a really revelatory moment when I arrived in San Francisco. I moved to San Francisco for the great artistic and intellectual place that it was, and a place for people who were a bit different and outside of the ordinary. And it was an amazing place to live. But I went there without a job, and it was a place that was very expensive to live. So I knew I needed to get one fast. And I had just come from working in a commercial art gallery where I was a great salesperson. And I was a salesperson because I loved the artwork, and I was able to talk about it very easily with people and to explain to them what the artwork would do for them. But I had great sales in that place, and beyond anything that you'd see probably anymore now that things are a bit more difficult. But I arrived into San Francisco, and I could go in 2 different ways. I could follow that path of being a salesperson, or I could follow that path of art.
And presumably you could have made a lot of money.
I could have, yeah. Like I actually had, there was a moment, you know, you get these moments sometimes in your life. There was a moment when I had 2 job offers in hand, and one was incredibly well paid, and I wouldn't have to worry about money. And it came with a huge list of benefits, including health insurance, which in America is a really big deal. And it meant working in the downtown district and, you know, just dressing for the part, the whole thing, the whole professional career in sales. And then I also simultaneously had a job offer in hand from this little nonprofit mural center in the Mission District. And it was like no money. It was very little money, no benefits, no sick leave, no nothing. It was like every nonprofit I think I've ever worked for, that it was just run bare bones. And I had these 2 job offers in my hand, and I felt like here was a moment where you actually decide the course of your life and who you are. And I chose the art center I think I maybe, it was very tempting to go for the money. But I think in my heart, I knew that, because I had come from a difficult job, even though it was in the arts, it was a very difficult job to live every day. And I knew that it wasn't doing me any good as a person. But when I walked into the art center and I saw that I would be surrounded by artists making art, that was a precious thing. It was not something that you could codify with an amount of money or a number of benefits. It was something that I was entering into, if you'll forgive me this, I was entering into a sacred space where creativity was flourishing and people were supporting each other. And there aren't that many places like that. So I knew when I walked in that door, if I could be a part of that, that it would push me in the right direction, and that I would then be that much closer to being the person that I wanted to be as a as an artist, acting and working as an artist. So I took that job, and it wasn't any bit of a disappointment. It did get me that further down the road, and then it sent me out on my own into the world, that much further along to being a professional artist, an artist working at my craft. And yeah, so that was one of my big moments in life.
Love it. And when did, or how did the winds of change arrive to blow you from San Francisco to Clare, or did you get blown elsewhere, or choose to go elsewhere in the between there and Clare? So
No, it was an incredibly direct wind that blew me directly from San Francisco to Lahinch, County Clare. And there was a man involved, my lovely husband, Steve. But we were looking at the cast of things, and this is going to sound mad considering the political times that we're living in, and I won't get into the political times that we're living in. But at that moment, 20 years ago, it seemed like very dark political times. And I thought that American politics was going in a very bad direction in terms of my own take on it. And we had a choice. We kind of had to commit to staying there for the next few years or leaving and finding a new place to live. So we decided, my husband is a British citizen, we decided that it was time to find a new place. And we had, Steve had spent a lot of time in Ireland through the years and loved it. He loved the place, he loved the people. He found it to be one of those really unique places in the world where you can find a new home and feel that it's the right place for you. He said,
he a surfer, Sarah, or how did he? What was his connection to Lahinch specifically?
He's not a surfer. No, I think he has a great appreciation for the music, and that was, he's very musically minded, while not being a musician himself. And for him, Ireland and Clare and the music was always a great draw. The freedom in the crack and the laugh that you'd have in a warm pub on a dark night, you know, that kind of thing. And he had memories of time spent with friends here in Clare, and it always felt like it would be a really great place to live. So he sold it to me, and I had at the time not really been here before, and still we moved here, and we arrived in, and he went from being a city boy who wanted to live in the country, and I was a country girl that wanted to live in the city. And he convinced me that this countryside was a good place and that I'd be happy here. And sure enough, I am. It's a beautiful landscape for someone with an eye. It's a truly profoundly beautiful landscape. I think that this there's an emotion in the land, in the way that the rocks are broken at the coastline, in the way that the hedgerows contour the hillside, in the way that northern light hits the side of every blade of grass in the pasture. There is a beauty in the landscape here which is quiet and subtle, and it could take my whole life to find a way to make it, to bring it to the canvas. But I think that's wonderful, you know.
Wow. You speak about it so beautifully. It's lovely to hear. It's and so it sounds like Clare is almost a gift that keeps giving in that sense, that the landscape continues to kind of, that's not becoming staid in any way for you.
Not at all. Not at all. It's. I think the only difficult part is to get yourself out into the landscape. Sometimes it seems, when you see the rain on the window pane and you hear the wind rushing past, you think, I'm not going out in that. That's brutal.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
It is, but I find that the more you do get out into it, the more you realize it's not actually as bad as you think it is from inside.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, I think the wind does that. The wind tends to be howling a lot, and it sounds worse from inside sometimes than it is.
Than it is, yeah. And you need a good pair of waterproofs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's.
Yeah.
And Sarah, we're going to finish up shortly, but I just want to ask, you know, a lot of people, or some people rather, have this notion as artists as these other people with, you know, certainly people can have their own special gifts, and people have it in all sorts of ways, whether it be being an engineer or a tradesperson or an artist or a musician, whatever it is. But, you know, I like to kind of explore this notion that everybody has some degree of creativity in them, in finding that. And do you come across that a lot, you know, that just that kind of othering, but not seeing oneself as a creative soul, if you like?
I do, and I think there's that a lot of schools have a lot to answer for, I think, with the way that art is taught, and the way that children are taught and told, and I think, you know, overly criticized about the way that they're expressing themselves visually. I remember very clearly an art lesson I had as a child, where we were all to draw a particular shape of red flower with a green stem and a green leaf. And that was the way to do it. And we all were taught that you do this shape, and this is the red flower, and this is the green stem, this is the shape of the green leaf. And I think a lot of art is kind of taught that way, that you should show someone a thing and how to paint it. And it's like, it really is, and excuse the cliche, it is really putting the cart before the horse. That what we all need to do is to look more carefully, to look more long, to spend time looking. That is the essence of art. That what we're doing is looking and sharing our looking. So this thing that we have of snap, 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 we're taking pictures, we're capturing this moment. There is nothing more rewarding than, instead of snapping a photo, to actually sit and draw or sketch or paint a place or a moment, because you really get inside it then. So what I see of art is that as long as we all have eyes and are able to see, we're all capable of it. It's the manner of putting it down, whether on paper or canvas or in sculpture or in some other medium. The way that we have of doing that is our own particular gift, and each of us will do it differently. I don't mind sharing techniques or how I do things, because I know that what I do from entirely within myself, entirely in my own way. I don't think anyone else will be able to do that. They're not me. So each child, in a sense, has the unique gift of their own way of expression. Given the guidance and support, they'll find that path. And if they continue to follow it and learn and grow skills and take on knowledge without being pulled off course, then they can follow the inner guidance that's within themselves. It's when you get shut down, and all of us are capable of shutting others down, and all of us are capable of being shut down and broken by what other people say to us. I was actually talking to my husband about that this morning, that I look at my old paintings and I recognize their weaknesses. I see them very clearly. No one else has to tell me. I see it myself. But if you had said their weaknesses to me at that moment when I was painting it, I think I might have stopped. And that artist inside myself could have been broken irreparably. And then maybe never proceeded. So while it's important to guide and teach and give skills and learn technical capabilities of materials and this kind of thing, it's more important to do that than to criticize, because in the end we are going to be our own worst critics, especially artistically. It's so important to guide and encourage, teach and encourage, to give comfort and strength to artists. It's such an awfully vulnerable thing that we're doing. And then when we're strong and competent and careful and capable in our own way, then you can be critical, because hopefully then we've grown the armor that we need to deal with the world. But there's nothing more vulnerable than a baby artist. It's so hard. It's so terrible. I put that word out there. Please nurture your little artists. They're so precious.
And yourself as well, you know, just when we're giving ourselves permission, or when we're experimenting or exploring, your inner critic can be the worst demon of all, can't it?
Oh my God, they're so bad. They're so bad. There was a great TED talk that someone turned me on to by Elizabeth Gilbert, where she talked about the Greek notion of the genius, which is that great works aren't actually done by us as humans. It's a method of channeling an outside genius that exists in the spirit world. Say that what we do as artists and creators and makers is that we're actually channeling an external force that comes through us in the making. And what's lovely about that concept is that I think that when you create something quite beautiful and exceptional, it's a trap that traps you into wanting the next work to be as good, and that you feel a great pressure and a force of needing every piece, every work that you do to be as good as the last, to be better than the last. And so in acknowledging that you can make great things, then you think, I must always be that good. And that is something that will never happen. So you're setting yourself up to fail. Whereas if you can acknowledge that this great gift of creativity is being channeled through you, and that what you need to do in order to prepare for your work is to make yourself receptive, rather than to gird yourself up to be the genius and the great master, then I think it's a metaphor for the mental state that you need to create in order to make work. And that by opening your heart and your brain and your creativity to receptivity, to turning on that switch of openness, then you're creating a mental state which is more conducive to creative work, rather than saying, I will create this masterpiece. This is the steps that I need to do to create it. And then inevitably that piece will fail, because you have to be open and to follow spontaneity and the artistic moment in order to follow where something is going to be the best that it can be. That was something that I do return to, that thought of channeling and being receptive rather than focusing on the end result, that the process is everything, really.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate your time and sharing all your insights and stories with me, and look forward to seeing what new creations are unfolding.
Every day something new. It's great.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rory. Thanks for the time and the chat.
Thank you.